Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Pilot Lawyer Podcast. Thank you for your attention while this important legal information is reviewed. What you hear should not replace consultation with an attorney and should not be considered advice for your situation. On behalf of the Pilot Lawyer and your entire crew, it's our pleasure to have you aboard.
Welcome, aviators, to the Pilot Lawyer Podcast with us, the Eisen brothers at the Eisen Law Firm, where aviation law is all we do. You're here for what we do best, navigating the FAA medical certification process for pilots and those who want to become pilots. Around the office, we say, if you don't laugh, you cry. And for the next 30 minutes, we hope to bring you the lighter side of what can otherwise be a frustrating process. So whether you're laughing at us or with us, join us brothers as we discuss the fascinating world of FAA medical certification.
Sound effect, Larry. I think you did a great job reading that script today.
Hey, what is this? Is this a discussion or is this some kind of circle of people patting each other on the back? That's in reference to somebody, Tree Hugger Joe, who commented on our YouTube. You know who you are.
Can't say his name.
What?
Why
I
can't
don't
you
know
say
his name. That's his handle. That's his script.
Yeah, well, you
whatever.
can't. I mean,
I call him out.
now he's gonna
Yeah.
go double barrel.
Come at me.
Let 'em.
Come at me, bro. Anyhow, we thank you for being with us here today. This is Christopher Eisen, sometimes known as, what is it?
Sound Effect
Sound
Larry.
Effect Larry. Then we have Alex Eisen.
That's accurate.
That's Bozo. And then we have the Big Cheese,
The
Anthony
big
Eisen.
cheese. Where's the applause?
Anywho, today we're going to be discussing SSRI medications and whether you can or cannot use them and hold a medical certificate with the FAA. That sounds like just titillating.
Riveting.
Anywho, let's just cut right to the...
Right through the guano.
Yeah, let's get right to it. Let's ask the Big Cheese. Can you have an SSRI medication that you're actively using and still hold a medical certificate?
It depends. Thank you for having me. Let's discuss.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
No, you couldn't hold this podcast together without me, baby.
You're the brains behind the operation. I'm just the looks. And then we have Alex.
Hi.
You look good with your eyes shut. Let me say this much.
That's really creepy.
SSRI. Can you get a medical certificate while you have it? Well, here's what we get a lot of around the office when somebody calls in. Oh, well, I went to see my AME, and the AME saw that I was on Prozac, and they deferred me. The AME deferred me. But I don't know why. It says Prozac is an approved medication on the FAA's website. Wrongo.
I don't
Come
know.
on,
Which
just
one
push
do you want
one,
me to
just
take?
push
Alice,
one.
I'm not very good at this, okay? This
Obviously.
isn't where I
Does
shine.
never flow.
Well,
just pick one now.
obviously.
Pick one now.
There we go.
Fine. So anyhow, now he's mixing the volume. Okay. It is an approved medication and it isn't. SSRI medications are antidepressant medications.
Oh, wait. Let's look at the medical professional here. Do you know anything about SSRI medication?
Kinda.
Kind of. Well, that's not really your forte, huh?
No.
Okay, whatever. Moving on.
Waste of time and waste of space.
Don't forget money.
Definitely waste of money. Anyhow, here's what we got. So if you're taking the antidepressant for an SSRI, in theory, yes. But SSRI medications are only approved for the purpose of a special issuance. And so they're not really approved. They're still disqualifying medications. You can't walk in, say to your AME, hey, I'm on Prozac. Hey, I'm on Lexapro, one of the other 4 medications. I'll get to that in a second. And walk out with a medical. You're always going to end up getting deferred. And procedurally, you'll ultimately get denied as well for a regular medical certificate. But you'll be found eligible if you jump through certain hoops and go through what they call the decision path 2 to essentially be issued a waiver or special issuance.
What is the decision path? Like, let's say you have the medication, you're actively taking it, you want to continue to take it. Let's say you decide you want to try and go down that decision path, for the SSRI, as opposed to just quitting the medication and trying to establish eligibility without, having a prohibited medication that you're actively taking. So let's say we're going to go down this SSRI pathway. What are the steps?
Well,
What are the pitfalls?
there are certain ways that we would go about it versus maybe how the FAA would present it to you. So if you went and saw your AME and said, I'm taking Prozac, and it got deferred, you'd wait probably 2 months. The FAA would send you a letter and say, hey, we want you to send us treatment records. We want you to go see a HIMSS AME. We want you to do all these things. What we would recommend first is before you see anyone, before you do anything, gather all your medical records relative to your treatment with the SSRI medication. And you want to see what exactly is in your treatment records. Because your file, if you remain on the medication, is going to be heavily scrutinized as to the effectiveness of treatment throughout your course of using the SSRI medication. So what are you looking for there? Well, what happens is once the FAA gathers all the documentation they want to see before they'll make a decision, they're going to be looking for a few things. One is that your medication cannot be treating a diagnosis outside of certain parameters. Those, to say that in a way,
Dumb it down for Bozo.
Yeah.
In a way, that what I'm getting at is you can't be taking a medication for anything other than these conditions. Major depressive disorder, whether it's a single episode or recurrent episode, dysthymic disorder, adjustment disorder with depressed mood, or any non-depression related conditions. So, for example, you're taking an SSRI because your palms are sweaty.
So you're saying that if I have one of those conditions, it's okay?
It's okay. But if you're taking an SSRI for bipolar disorder or
Psychosis?
So you're talking
psychosis.
like off-label use.
Maybe it is a label use. Off-label for the FAA. Dude, I'll cue you when it's time to talk. So anyhow.
Your 2 cents aren't worth the copper
Well,
they're printed on.
So if
Well-
you go and you try to get a medical or special issuance while you're taking one of these SSRIs and you go through all the shenanigans and then ultimately it gets reviewed and the FAA says, oh, well, you know you're taking this for X condition that isn't one of the approved conditions. I mean, you got a problem there, baby, because now you've done all these steps for them to ultimately say, well, it's got to be one of these conditions. So that's number one. Number two, how long have you been on the medication?
6 years.
Well, that's perfect because we need a minimum of 6 continuous months prior to consideration so that the FAA can establish that you've been clinically stable. All right. Have you ever been clinically stable, Alex?
Never.
I didn't think so. That being said, oh, yeah, baby.
Oh, Larry's on it today.
Number 3, and perhaps one of the most important pieces here, is that there are only 5 now medications which are approved as an antidepressant use. Those are Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, and congratulations, we now have Wellbutrin added to the list, which isn't technically an SSRI.
Is that a recent addition?
Oh my gosh, that is so recent.
How recent?
Within the past 2 weeks, give or take.
Oh, wow.
Can you believe that?
I know.
Where have you been the past 2 weeks?
I've been doing work.
Not here.
Oh.
Hit it. But I would note that it's Wellbutrin extended release or sustained release. There are other formulations of the medication that are not approved.
Now, I had heard a few weeks ago before all this that there would be additional medications they were considering. Was this what
Who
was
have you
the-
been talking to?
Your mom.
Oh.
What did she say?
Whoa.
But seriously, do you know
Yeah,
if
it's
there's
my
other?
understanding that through an article that was published that there may be very well be additional medications being considered for approval as well as we go on down the line here.
But not yet.
Not yet.
As of right now,
as
it's
of
just
right
those
now,
5.
it's just these 5.
Let me ask you this: is there anything else you need to go over there with that?
Yeah, there's other things, and probably
Oh,
some of the
jeez.
most important things.
Well, why?
The
Well,
fact
like,
that
do
you-
it.
why
Why'd
are
you leave that to last?
Yeah, you're. What do they call it when you're burying the lead, man?
Come on.
Get to it.
People
Uh,
have
well-
turned off their radio and gotten out of their car, and they're not coming back.
Okay, so the most important piece here, and this is why I started with go get your records, okay, is that you cannot in your entire history have ever had psychosis, suicidal ideation, electroconvulsive therapy, treatment with multiple SSRIs concurrently, or a multi-agent drug protocol use. So what does that even mean? Well, I would tell you that so many times we'll have people applying for a medical certificate while staying on the SSRI medication. And the FAA will want to see all your records. They'll want a psychiatric evaluation and neuropsych evaluation. I'll discuss that in a second. But they'll spend thousands of dollars on evaluations and months of their time, if not years, processing through the FAA for them to review the SSRI submission, all for it to be reviewed by a psychiatrist at the federal air surgeons level, whereupon they assess your treatment records and they disqualify you for the SSRI program because of one of these disqualifying prerequisites. What we see a lot of time are situations where individuals have been treated with multiple SSRIs or on a multi-agent drug protocol use. So what does that mean? For example, let's say you started a medication, Prozac, early on in your treatment, and it wasn't really working, so they added in Wellbutrin. You're taking both medications for a period of time. So what's mostly at issue is that individuals that have been treated with multiple medications for a period of time, because their symptoms have been volatile, and this is I'm not a doctor, but I'm telling you what I've heard, what I've seen, and what I do every day. The records will reflect someone who has had a volatile symptomology, if you will.
Symptomology.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
Yeah, he'll allow it.
I'll allow it.
Symptomology,
Sustained.
such that when you're coming down to just one medication, which they'll only approve you while you're taking one medication, you can't be on more than one medication for the SSRI protocol. The question then, from a layman's perspective, is that they don't know if the single dose medication protocol will effectively treat your symptoms, because historically you've had this situation where you've required more than one medication to cull the symptoms. So if you say, hey, I'm just taking Prozac now, I'm going along fat, dumb, and happy, which you know about the fat and dumb.
I'm familiar.
It ends up in a situation where, how do we know the risk for recurrent symptoms is not there? So how do we know that the risk for recurrent symptoms is mitigated by the single dose use? Because previously you've needed different medication. You need more than one medication. Because the name of the game here, my friends, is risk for recurrent symptoms. The FAA needs to be able to say, well, we know this person has major depressive disorder recurrent, but this single dose of Prozac is effectively treating that risk for recurrent symptoms based off of historical symptoms and so on and so forth. In this individual's use with the Prozac, it would establish that risk for recurrent symptoms is limited. Now, if you've had suicidal ideation, or if you've had a history of psychosis, you end up in a spot where it would very well trigger a risk for recurrent symptoms. Now, one other thing that I would add is that even though it's not on the FAA's official list, we'll see concerns when there has been psychiatric hospitalization as a potential risk for recurrent symptoms. And that's not a specific disqualifier for the program, but that would increase their concern for that level of risk for recurrent symptoms.
Has your FAA medical certificate been denied? Are you concerned you may not be able to get a medical certificate from the FAA? Are you at risk for FAA action for failing to report your medical history appropriately? Call the pilot lawyer at 1-855-FAA-1215 to discuss your options for getting the FAA to issue your medical certificate and get you flying. We are happy to evaluate your case and discuss with you a plan for presenting your case to the AME or the FAA. Aviation law is all we do, nothing else.
So other than all of that you so expertly articulated, is there anything else that you would have to be concerned about moving forward on the SSRI pathway?
I would say as such.
What does that even mean? What does that even mean?
Well, here's the thing.
Yes or no.
Yeah, it's a yes or no,
let's
counselor.
kind of go back to what the process is. So let's say you go to your AME, you've gotten the records per advice of counsel. My advice.
That's what you did.
And then
advise.
you go to the AME, you submit the application, you're going to get deferred. What does deferred mean? that means that the AME can't issue the medical certificate. They have to defer to the FAA to consider whether or not you're eligible to hold a medical. The FAA is then send you back a letter, and they're going to essentially say they want all your records. They want you to engage with what's known as a HIMSS trained AME, Aviation Medical Examiner. They'll want you to be evaluated by a HIMSS trained psychiatrist, and then have a HIMSS trained neuropsychologist evaluate you from a cognitive standpoint. Beyond that, there's additional documentation that will be needed as well from your treating physician, establishing that treatment is continuing to go well, and that they would be willing to notify the FAA if there's any issues with your treatment, and so on and so forth. There's also a request for a personal statement, but that's kind of like polishing a turd at that point. You've got all these people saying these things, kind of, unless you're going in there and saying, hey, I've got major problems, you're contradicting everything you've told everybody else. I mean, what's a personal statement at that point? So that being said, you could do that, but you also want to kind of look at the possibility of decision path 1.
Which was taking yourself completely off the medication?
Not taking yourself off the medication.
Well,
with doctor's care. Please, you're going to have people reaching for their pill bottle and then dropping it.
Into the toilet.
Into the toilet.
And then flushing
Much
it.
like this podcast.
I don't have a toilet flushing. Why don't you go in there and flush the toilet real quick so we can get a sound effect?
That being said,
what I was saying was you take yourself off the medications with the counsel, oversight, and approval of your treating provider. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, so let's say you came to us and you said, hey, I had a history of major depressive disorder, single episode, or I had some anxiety disorder, or I had an adjustment disorder. I have been taking the medication I'm on the medication, let's say. I'm on Lexapro. I've been on it for 1.5 years. I'm going to sort of establish, we need to see what's in your records. Because again, we're looking at, has there ever been a multi-drug protocol and so on and so forth, to sort of triage the question of whether or not you would even be eligible for the SSRI protocol. Either way, though, the question would then be, well, can you come off the medication safely with your doctor's oversight? And can documentation be generated as to how you're doing coming off the medication? If so, you may wish to consider whether or not coming off of the medication for 60 days and then being able to establish for the FAA that the underlying condition is not at risk for recurrent symptoms. That would potentially be a more effective and efficient, certainly less costly way of getting your medical certificate than just staying on the medication. Because if your underlying condition is not inclined to be at risk for recurrent symptoms and you don't need the medication, if your doctor's willing to take you off the medication, that could put you in a spot where you may consider going that pathway rather than staying on the medication and jumping through all of these hoops. Now, what conditions that would be are typically conditions that are not inclined by their very nature to be recurrent. So major depressive disorder recurrent is not one that we would really consider unless there's an argument to say, hey, that was a misdiagnosis and we can try to debunk that.
What if somebody... That's a different podcast. That's a different podcast. We're running short on time here. Nobody wants to hear us for another 10 minutes just vamp. But let me ask this question.
That's some pretty good content. I wouldn't consider that vamping.
Yeah.
Anywho, let's say you come to us and you're on a SSRI medication that's not approved under the SSRI pathway. You don't have any other history of treatment with any other medications other than just this one SSRI. Can you switch over to an approved medication? Or will the FAA look at that as having had a multi-drug protocol that would disqualify you under the SSRI pathway?
So it wouldn't, because there wasn't concurrent use. You have to have concurrent use for that to be the problem. But the thing is, if you stop taking the other SSRI, for example, would be Paxil. So you're taking Paxil and you decide, hey, I got to stay on an SSRI, man. So then the question is, well, I'm going to transition over to the Lexapro, for example. The FAA will want to see that you're stable on the Lexapro for at least 6 months before they'll even consider you jumping through the hoops of seeing the HIMSS AME, seeing the HIMSS neuropsych, and so on and so forth.
So it's not just something that you can just willy-nilly snap your fingers and start going down that process with the FAA immediately. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some forethought, some strategy.
No, it's an overnight thing. You'll have your medical
I
next
misread
day.
this entire
You'll have your
podcast.
medical next day. But you're right.
What about the HIMSS neuropsychologists? Do they have any impact in the success of the outcome in these
Yeah,
cases?
let's say you have all your ducks lined up. You go in for the neuropsych evaluation and you don't do so well. Now, all of a sudden, you're going to get denied for cognitive deficiencies. So that's a consideration as well. But I would say that they recently changed the rule to where you no longer have to have annual COG screens on the SSRI special issuance.
They didn't notify me of that.
They did. You just weren't awake.
I didn't read the memo.
I would vote this podcast as the most dull of all of them.
Well, I don't think so.
Wait, what grounds do you have? Discuss.
Well, is there anything else that you feel is pertinent to the discussion with SSRI and
Yeah,
the
I do.
pathway?
I do.
Do tell.
All right. So let me tell you this much. You know how I was saying you could maybe go off your medication, you could maybe argue you don't have this or that, or maybe, you know, debunk some of your diagnoses and so on.
Sure.
Sure, that's still a possibility. But the impression is that for the most part, if you have a diagnosis or history of major depressive disorder recurrent, the FAA is going to sort of want to see you on an SSRI medication. Now, there are certainly cases where we try to argue that, hey, listen, this airman doesn't want to be on a medication, they're doing well, and this risk for recurrent symptoms could be mitigated through engagement with treatment, with a therapist, and so other mitigating or effective ways to avoid that risk for recurrent symptoms. But it's typically their impression that they're going to want to see that. Now, so that's where it gets fairly nuanced. If, you know, maybe you have a major depressive disorder recurrent diagnosis, but you're on a disqualifying combination of SSRI medications, what do you do then? Because now you're kind of cooked because, well, they're going to want to see me on an SSRI, but I don't qualify for the program. So what am I going to do? In that case, you know, typically we want to see, can you come off the medication, you know, effectively first? And what they say at the FAA is, of course, they want you to be healthy first. And that's what we would say as well. So certainly don't do anything that's going to jeopardize your health. But if you're with
Can
your
you
doctor,
say but after that? Don't do anything to jeopardize your health,
But
yeah, I'm going to.
Okay, fine. But
Let me underline, don't do anything to jeopardize your health. See, I made it work. If you have, now you've got my whole train of thought.
you were talking about your doctor.
off whack.
But your doctor.
Yeah, okay. If your doctors want to say, hey, listen, bucko, you don't really need this medication anyhow. I was just giving it to you for just because insurance purposes.
kickbacks.
Sure,
He knows
whatever.
all about
yeah.
Yeah, because I prescribed so much in my day.
Alex doesn't prescribe.
No.
He just describes.
And
So-
we'd ask that you subscribe to this podcast.
Yes.
Anyhow, so your
Nobody's
doctor,
subscribing
So
to
your doctor
this.
says, hey, you didn't really need this to begin
You
with.
didn't really need this to begin with. So then the effect is, okay, well, now I'm going to have to come off a medication, try to go down decision path one and establish that even though this is my diagnosis, that either one, it's not my diagnosis. And you can do that through impeaching the diagnosis through maybe psychiatric evaluations and so on, a quality psychiatric evaluation, maybe a HIMSS psychiatrist, or you can say, yes, this is my diagnosis, but it's effectively being treated with vigorous engagement with therapy and maybe even monitoring with the HIMSS AME and so on.
Well, I see us turning base to final, and the airport is in view. No, the runway's in view.
Oh boy.
We don't want to land on the tarmac. We want to land on the runway.
I
so
think this has smoke trailing from the
Yeah.
wings and it's
the plane's
spiraling.
on fire. We're doing a nosedive in. But let's just talk about our final thoughts here. Ultimately, potentially doable to get a medical while being on an SSRI, correct?
It is, but you got to be very careful with the details. One of my favorite companies in the world is Pepperidge Farms.
It shows.
Because they produce some of the tastiest snacks. With that being said, though, even though we're not trying to pick up a sponsorship from Pepperidge Farms, wouldn't it be funny if we got one? I mean, wouldn't it be funny if they were a sort of little Debbie?
Ooh.
Anyhow.
I would take any sponsor from any of the major cookie companies.
We know. Don't pay us in cash. We want cookies.
Frito-Lays, I'll take chips.
What is this? So is this a discussion, or are we, patting each other on the back in a circle? Point is, it's complicated. It's not as easy as it looks.
Where I was going with Pepperidge Farm is that the good is in the details.
Sure.
And I've also heard the devil's in the details.
I don't think our landing gear has come out. I
Yeah.
think
We're
I gotta
going
dialing on this
manually
thing.
crank it out here, but
Jeez.
I guess
Okay.
my point here is
Memphis
that
Belle
the details of your medical records and what's being presented with respect to this risk for recurrent symptoms, with respect to the disqualifying prerequisites, we've had cases where people have gone all the way to the tippy top to be evaluated by the federal air surgeon after a psychiatrist has sort of overlooked these prerequisites, neuropsychologists and so on. And then they say, hey, well, listen, this guy was maybe taking these medications, early on in treatment and denied.
You got anything else you want to add to this, or can we wrap it up?
So when I was a little boy,
Yeah, nobody wants to hear about that.
I
All
never
right.
was little.
Poor
fat.
boy. Well, you've logged another uneventful half hour listening to the Pilot Lawyer podcast
That's
with
a
the
lot.
Ison brothers of the Ison Law Firm. You'll know it's us when you see the buffets board up their windows as we walk past. We'll see you next time. Have a good day.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.